It was a cold, overcast morning at the local market. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread and the chatter of tired customers sifting through crates of produce. But the mood inside the grocery store had shifted. It wasn't just the usual bustle today. There was a palpable tension in the air, and it all started at the checkout counter. An elderly woman, hunched and fragile, stood with her coins scattered across the counter, her hands shaking as she tried to count out the exact change for her groceries. Her hands trembled more than usual as she carefully sorted the nickels, dimes, and quarters, each piece of metal seeming to weigh more than it should. The cashier, a young woman named Laura, rolled her eyes so loudly you could almost hear them. "Are you kidding me?" she muttered under her breath, looking at the growing line behind the woman. "I don't have all day. You can't just use bills like everyone else." The elderly woman, oblivious to the rudeness of Laura's words, kept her head down, carefully adjusting the coins, clearly struggling. A few people in line behind her exchanged impatient glances, the line getting longer, more restless. Laura sighed dramatically, tapping her fingers against the register as if trying to signal the woman that she was taking too long. "This is why I hate working these shifts," Laura continued, louder now, so the others in line could hear. "Every time it's someone like her, holding everyone up. If you can't afford to shop, maybe you should stay home." The elderly woman flinched, her hands pausing midair as if the words had struck her harder than any physical blow. Her voice, soft and raspy, barely cut through the tension. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't mean to take so long. I'm just not very good at counting," she stammered, her face flushed with embarrassment, her hands still unsteady. But Laura wasn't having it. "Well, maybe you should just stop shopping then, huh? You're holding up the entire line," she snapped, the words sharp and venomous. The woman's eyes dropped even lower, her face a mask of shame, and she hastily began to count the coins again. At that moment, the next person in line, a man wearing a dark suit, cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Is this really how you treat your customers?" he asked, his tone calm, almost polite. But there was something in his voice that made everyone pause. Laura blinked, caught off guard by the question. She looked up at him, not sure what to make of the interruption. "Excuse me." Laura shot back, not quite masking the defensiveness in her voice. "I'm just trying to get this done so everyone else isn't wasting their time. Maybe if she wasn't counting coins like it's her life savings." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're talking to, do you?" he asked, his words measured, almost chilling. There was an air of authority in his voice that made the people in line, including Laura, shift uncomfortably. "You just assumed she was some helpless old lady who couldn't even count change. You really think that's how you should treat someone? What kind of person are you?" Laura opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. She could feel the heat rising in her face, the sting of humiliation creeping up her neck. Her eyes shifted from the man to the elderly woman, who was now looking down at the floor, her face flushed with embarrassment, her hands still trembling as she tried to finish counting the last of the change. And then it hit her. The coins. The old woman. The way Laura had been so quick to judge, to humiliate someone just because they didn't fit into her idea of normal. She hadn't even stopped to think. Before she could find the words to apologize, the man turned his attention to the cashier again. "You know, you might want to be a little more careful with how you treat people, especially when you don't know who's standing in line behind them." His voice, though firm, was calm, as if he were offering a simple piece of advice. Laura, embarrassed and unsure of how to respond, stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. And just as Laura was about to stammer out an apology, the man pulled out a black card from his wallet, one that shimmered slightly under the fluorescent lights, and slid it across the counter with a smooth motion. The sound of it hitting the counter echoed through the store, and for a moment, everything went quiet. "I think I'll take care of this," he said, his eyes never leaving Laura's. Laura stared at the card, at the gleaming black surface, her heart sinking into her stomach. Then it clicked. This wasn't just any man standing in line. He wasn't just another customer. The realization hit her all at once. The man wasn't just someone in a suit. He was someone whose face was plastered all over the media, someone who didn't need to say his name. Donald Trump, in the flesh, standing in line behind an elderly woman with coins. And for the first time in her life, Laura felt like she was the one in the wrong. Laura's hands froze over the register, still hovering over the keys, the black card sitting there on the counter, gleaming under the store's fluorescent lights. She blinked, unable to look away from the card, from him. Her breath caught in her throat as the man, no, Trump, looked back at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry, just disappointed, and somehow that seemed worse. She had to have been imagining things. Maybe this was some kind of prank, right? A guy in a suit and tie pulling out a fancy black card that was probably some sort of marketing gimmick or a cheap knockoff. But no, the card had a weight to it, a finality, and when she glanced at the old woman standing at the counter, she saw it in her face, the quiet recognition of someone who had been wronged, someone who had seen this kind of treatment before. Though maybe never so openly, never in front of so many people. Laura's mouth went dry. The realization that she'd been rude to someone so publicly, so loudly, hit her like a slap across the face. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the store on her, waiting for her to react, for her to make this right. But all she could do was stare at the man, her mind spinning in circles. The elderly woman shifted uneasily, still fumbling with the coins, but now more slowly, as if the moment had stolen all her energy. She looked up at Laura, her tired eyes full of confusion and something else, maybe even sadness. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hold up the line, she said, barely audible, voice quivering as she held up a quarter that seemed to weigh a ton in her hands. Her breath came in shaky bursts as she looked down at the coins again, the act of counting becoming more of a chore than it had been before. Don't apologize, Trump said suddenly, his voice breaking through the thick silence that had settled in the air. He turned to the elderly woman, his face softening just the slightest bit. It's not your fault. Then, without missing a beat, he turned to Laura. But it's yours, isn't it? Laura, still stuck in a kind of stunned stupor, could barely force herself to breathe. Her face felt flushed with embarrassment, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the elderly woman and the way she was still trying to gather the coins. The rattling sound of metal against the counter filled the space between them, and Laura's hand shook slightly as she reached for the card, to swipe it, to just get the transaction over with so the woman could leave. Take her groceries, Trump said, his voice steady, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at Laura, as though he were seeing straight through her. All of them. No charge. Laura's hand stilled, her fingers frozen on the card. She felt like the room was closing in on her, like everything in the market had somehow vanished except for this moment, this mistake, this humbling truth. The man was watching her, waiting for her to act, and she could feel his eyes, not in an arrogant way, but in a way that made her question everything she had done up to that point. The elderly woman was still trying to count, oblivious to the exchange happening right beside her. Her mind was clearly somewhere else, maybe stuck in the memories of a time when things were easier, before people had started treating her like a nuisance for just existing. Laura opened her mouth to say something, to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. It wasn't enough, not even close. She had made this woman feel like a burden, like she didn't belong, and now, even with the man in the suit telling her to fix it, she didn't know how to. Laura stammered, struggling for the words, but they wouldn't come. Instead, her gaze dropped to the counter, to the register that she had been working behind for months, to the coins, to the black card. I'm sorry, she finally managed, her voice small and tight. But the apology, though sincere, felt hollow. It was like trying to apologize for something that couldn't be fixed with just a few words. The woman had already been humiliated, already been treated like she was a problem to be dealt with rather than a person. And no simple apology would make up for that. Trump's expression didn't soften. Instead, he just nodded toward the woman's bags. Get them for her. Now. Don't make me say it again. Laura's hand trembled as she grabbed the items, scanning them quickly but too slowly for her taste. She tried to rush through it, trying to erase the horrible weight of the moment, but every action felt like a slow-motion replay of what had just happened. Each movement felt meaningless, the same routine she had done 100 times before, now twisted into something that felt wrong. But no matter how fast she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't doing enough. The elderly woman stood, watching her silently, still holding on to the quarter like it might float away if she let go. She didn't seem angry, didn't seem to care about the commotion or the attention, but there was something in her eyes, something resigned, something weary. Ma'am, Trump said suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise. I'll pay for your groceries. The woman's face shifted. Her tired eyes blinked, and for a moment, there was nothing but confusion in her expression. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice a soft rasp. Trump smiled, though it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was one of understanding, like he'd seen this before, knew exactly what was going on. You don't have to say anything, he replied. Just go home. Get some rest. And then, the man stood there, as if waiting for something to happen, like he was in control of the situation, waiting for Laura to finally do the right thing. Laura couldn't remember what happened after that. She finished ringing up the woman's groceries, her mind still a blur. The old woman left quietly, her bags clutched tightly in her hands, and Trump followed her out of the store with a quick nod, as if everything had been settled. Laura stood there, motionless for a few moments, the noise of the store continuing around her, the hum of the register, the shuffle of people's feet, all drowning out the silence that had crept into her thoughts. She had been so focused on the wrong things, the impatience, the frustration, when all it would have taken was a little kindness, a little humanity. It wasn't too late, but it might as well have been. She had learned her lesson too late. The hum of the market, the clink of coins, and the chatter of customers slowly returned to Laura's awareness as she stood there, rooted to the spot. The transaction was done. The old woman was gone, out the door with her bags, but something about it lingered in the air, thick and heavy, like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Her hands were still on the register, but they were useless now, not performing any task, just resting, numb. She was still trying to process everything that had happened, the sudden confrontation with Trump, the look on the elderly woman's face, the harsh words that had slipped from her mouth without even thinking, without understanding. The line behind her had grown longer, but no one dared to speak. It was as if the entire store was holding its breath, waiting for something, but unsure of what exactly. The moment was over, but the consequences were still hanging there, just out of reach, like an uncomfortable truth no one wanted to confront. Laura knew she should apologize to the next person in line, to at least acknowledge the weight of what had just occurred, but she didn't know how. She couldn't find the words to make it right. She had let her impatience, her frustration, blind her to what really mattered. She had treated that woman as if she was a problem, something to be dealt with, instead of a person with her own dignity, her own life, her own struggles. The next customer, a middle-aged man in a leather jacket, stepped up to the counter, his eyes glancing at Laura as he pulled out his wallet. "You all right?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in his tone, something that made Laura's stomach twist. "You seem off." Laura blinked, not expecting anyone to acknowledge the tension, let alone ask her how she was feeling. She swallowed, trying to find some way to explain herself, but all that came out was a shaky, "I'm fine, just tired." It sounded hollow, even to her own ears. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press her further. He just nodded and handed over his card, and for a brief moment, she was grateful for the silence. But the silence didn't last long. A voice from the back of the store broke through the quiet. "What's going on here?" It was a sharp, demanding voice, familiar, but not one Laura was expecting to hear. She turned to see the store manager, Michelle, walking toward her with a look of concern mixed with something else, something Laura couldn't quite place. Michelle stopped just short of the counter, her eyes flicking between Laura and the now empty spot where the elderly woman had been. Laura opened her mouth, but no words came out. She couldn't say what had just happened. She couldn't say that she had been so impatient, so cruel, and that it had taken a stranger, someone she didn't even know, to make her see it. "Laura," Michelle said again, her tone softer now, but still firm. "What happened?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Laura knew what Michelle was asking. She wasn't asking about the transaction. She was asking about the way the situation had unfolded, the way Laura had handled it. She could see the disapproval in Michelle's eyes, the slight shake of her head, the unspoken disappointment that had already started to settle between them. I messed up," Laura said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She stared down at the counter, not able to meet Michelle's gaze. "I was impatient. I thought she was holding up the line on purpose, but she wasn't. She was just trying to count the change." Laura felt her chest tighten as the weight of her actions began to sink in. "And I treated her like she was a problem." Michelle didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at Laura with a kind of quiet understanding, and it made Laura feel even worse. She could see it now, the image of the elderly woman, frail and alone, standing in front of her, just trying to buy groceries with what little she had. And Laura had been too wrapped up in her own world to even consider that. It had taken someone like Trump, someone with more money and power than she could ever imagine, to show her the truth. "I heard what happened," Michelle said finally, her voice soft but still carrying an edge of concern. "I also saw the way he handled it." "You've got to think before you speak, Laura. People have stories. You never know what someone's going through." "I know," Laura muttered, the sting of her own ignorance cutting deeper now. I should have helped her. I shouldn't have treated her like that." The silence between them stretched for a moment, and then Michelle sighed. "Look, everyone makes mistakes. But you need to learn from them, especially when it comes to how you treat people. Customers are human beings, not just transactions. And the ones who are vulnerable? They deserve even more respect, not less. Laura nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to apologize, to do something, anything to make things right, but it felt like the moment had passed. The damage was done, and the worst part was that she knew she had no one to blame but herself. The man in the suit, Trump, had tried to show her the right way, but she hadn't listened. She hadn't understood until it was too late. As Michelle walked away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet store, Laura felt the weight of the lesson settle on her shoulders. She had been in the wrong, and there was no easy way to fix it. She couldn't undo her actions, and she couldn't erase the way she had made that elderly woman feel. All she could do now was remember it, carry it with her, and hope that, somehow, she would never make the same mistake again. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, each minute dragging by as Laura replayed the scene in her mind over and over, wondering if she could have done something differently, if there was some way she could have been better, kinder. But it didn't change the fact that the woman was gone, that the moment was over, and that all she had left was the weight of her own regret. By the time she clocked out, the store was quiet, and the day was winding down. The sounds of the market had faded, the customers had gone, and Laura found herself standing outside, the cold air biting at her skin. She could still hear Trump's voice in her head, asking her why she had treated that woman like that, and the question gnawed at her. She had thought she was right, that she was justified in her frustration, but now she knew better. She knew she would never forget that moment, and she hoped, for the rest of her life, that she would always remember to treat people with the same dignity she expected for herself. The following day, Laura couldn't get the image of the elderly woman out of her head. The woman had been a blur, a shadow of someone who was caught between moments, struggling with the small things that most people overlooked. But now, every time Laura closed her eyes, she saw the woman's worn hands, trembling as they reached for the coins, her slow, careful movements. And she heard the voice of the man in the suit, demanding she do the right thing. It was like everything in the world had shifted in that one instant, and now it all felt too clear. She had expected the usual rush of customers when she arrived at work, busy chatter, the noise of shopping carts, the usual bustle, but today it felt different. The store seemed quieter, as if the world around her had slowed down just to give her time to think. And then, when she turned to punch in, she saw him again. Trump. It wasn't a coincidence. He was standing at the front of the store, his presence commanding attention. His eyes were scanning the aisles, not with the air of someone who was just passing through, but with the look of someone who had a purpose. Laura froze. She couldn't believe it. She knew she had already made a fool of herself in front of him yesterday, but now here he was again, standing at the entrance like he belonged, like he owned the place. She hadn't expected to see him again, not today, not ever. He didn't seem to notice her at first, but Laura couldn't look away. She watched as he walked through the aisles, his head turning as he observed the shoppers around him, not rushing, not distracted, just moving through the store like he had all the time in the world. The stark contrast between him and everyone else in the store was impossible to ignore. Most people were either in a rush, checking their phones, or just moving through the aisles. But he was still, almost deliberate in the way he looked at things, at people. Laura's stomach churned as the reality of the situation set in. She had to face him again. The last time they had interacted, she'd been so caught up in her own frustrations that she hadn't even noticed the power dynamic at play. He was someone who could buy a store, who could change lives with a single phone call. But none of that mattered to him. At least, not in the way Laura had expected. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she adjusted her apron. It was as if every single nerve in her body was screaming at her to leave the store, to hide, but she knew she couldn't do that. She had to own this, no matter how much she wanted to turn around and pretend like it never happened. And then, unexpectedly, he walked up to the counter where she was stationed, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was just the sound of the air conditioner humming in the background, the faint rustling of the wind outside, and the distant chatter of other customers. Laura opened her mouth, but she couldn't find the words. What was she supposed to say? How could she possibly make things right when she had already made such a mess of everything? She had tried to apologize yesterday, but it hadn't felt like enough. The damage was done, and she wasn't sure how to fix it. Trump finally broke the silence, his voice steady, without the slightest hint of anger. I don't think you understand something. Laura blinked, unsure of what he meant. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You've got it in your head that you made a mistake. That you did something wrong, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, But that's not the problem. She frowned, not following him. She was sure she'd made a mistake, that she had treated someone with disrespect. Wasn't that the issue? What else could there be? The problem, Trump continued, his voice growing firmer, is that you're treating the world like it's something to be fixed. People don't need fixing. They need respect. They need dignity. But you spend all your energy thinking about what went wrong, what you could have done differently, and you've missed the point entirely. Laura opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. She hadn't been thinking about it like that. She had been so focused on her own guilt, on how she had mishandled the situation, that she had never considered the bigger picture, what had actually happened to the elderly woman, what her life might have been like, or how she had been treated by people before. It wasn't just a transaction. It wasn't just about making amends. It was about treating people with the kind of respect that should have been automatic. You think a simple apology is going to fix everything, Trump continued, but it's not. It's never that simple. Laura felt a lump form in her throat. He was right. She had been so focused on apologizing, on trying to make everything go back to normal, that she had missed the core of it, the humanity of the situation, the fact that the woman had needed more than just an apology. She needed to feel seen. She needed to feel like she mattered. I don't know how to fix it, Laura said, her voice small. The weight of everything, the shame, the regret, the realization that she had done more harm than good, was too much to bear. I don't know what to do. Trump's eyes softened, just for a moment. You start by accepting that you can't always fix things. You can only move forward and do better next time. But you have to do it with a clear head, not just because you feel guilty. Laura nodded, the words sinking in deeper than she expected. She hadn't been thinking clearly. She had been acting out of fear, out of frustration. She had thought that making everything right would take away the guilt. But it wasn't about that. It was about making sure she never repeated the mistake. The moment hung between them for a while. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. She wanted to say something else, to ask him what she should do now, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. The situation had shifted, but it had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. And maybe that was the point. Before she could respond, Trump turned and walked away, his figure receding into the aisles. Laura stood there, the store feeling colder, emptier somehow. The words lingered in her mind, the truth of what he had said settling into her chest. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about moving forward, learning, and respecting the people she interacted with. It was about understanding the bigger picture, seeing beyond her own narrow view of the world. She knew what she had to do now. It wasn't a magic solution, but it was a start. And maybe that was enough. The next day, Laura walked into the store with a sense of purpose that had been missing for a long time. It wasn't the usual feeling of just going through the motions, doing her job because it was what she had to do. It wasn't the numbness that had settled into her every step after the incident with the elderly woman. No, today was different. The morning light seemed a little brighter as it filtered through the windows, and she could hear the hum of the store in a way that felt more alive than it had in weeks. Her mind was clearer now. There had been a shift, a slow and steady realization that she couldn't undo the past, but she could shape the future. She didn't know if she was completely free of the guilt she had carried around for the past few days, but she knew that guilt alone wasn't enough to drive change. She had to act. She had to make her actions match her intentions. It wasn't enough to think she could do better next time. She had to start doing better right now. As she walked past the aisles, she could see the usual customers in the store, some familiar faces, some new. It felt like everything was just as it had been before, but Laura couldn't ignore the change within herself. She no longer felt like an outsider to her own life, someone simply passing through the motions. She felt connected to these people, these moments, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged. When the store started to fill up with more customers later that afternoon, she saw a familiar face. It was the elderly woman from the other day. She was standing in line with her cane, her hands carefully counting out the change she had just enough of to pay for her groceries. Laura's heart tightened when she saw her. She had been avoiding thinking about this moment, knowing it was inevitable. The elderly woman was back, and now Laura had to face the consequences of her actions. For a moment, she stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. She could feel her pulse quicken, her stomach knotting. This was it. The moment she had dreaded, the moment when she would have to confront the mistake she had made. But as the elderly woman stepped up to the counter and placed her items in front of Laura, it wasn't anger or resentment in the woman's eyes. It wasn't a look of judgment or hurt. It was patience. The woman wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't demanding anything. She just wanted to buy her groceries. Laura swallowed, trying to steady her breath. This wasn't going to be easy. She had no idea how to fix the damage she had caused, but she couldn't let that stop her from trying. She had to try. "I'm so sorry," Laura said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was all she could manage at that moment. The words felt heavy, but she had to say them. She had to make things right. "I was rude the other day. I didn't mean to treat you like that. I was wrong." The elderly woman's eyes softened, and she paused for a moment, her hands still hovering over the counter. Laura's stomach churned, afraid that the woman would just brush her off or, worse, call her out for what she had done. But instead, the woman just nodded slowly, her face etched with the lines of a life lived with far too many hardships for anyone to judge. "I know you didn't mean it," the woman said gently, her voice slow and measured. "People get frustrated. I understand. But sometimes you've got to give people the benefit of the doubt." Laura felt her throat tighten as the woman's words hit deeper than she expected. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't holding anything over Laura's head. She was just acknowledging the situation for what it was, with an understanding that no one was perfect, that mistakes happened, and that people were, at the end of the day, just doing their best. "I was wrong," Laura said again, this time more firmly. "And I'll do better. I promise." The woman smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded again. "It's all right, dear. Just be kind next time." She handed over the exact change, and Laura took it, still feeling the weight of the moment, but also feeling a sense of relief she hadn't known she needed. As the woman left, walking with slow, deliberate steps toward the exit, Laura watched her go, feeling an odd mix of gratitude and sadness. She had expected an angry confrontation, but what she had received instead was an act of quiet grace. The woman hadn't demanded anything from her. She hadn't even seemed to expect an apology. All she wanted was to be treated with respect, with kindness, something Laura now understood, deep in her bones, was far more valuable than any transaction or any amount of time saved. Laura stood there for a moment, her hands still holding the change the woman had given her. The store felt quieter now, even with the buzz of other customers around her. It was as if the whole experience had created a space for her to pause, to reflect, to remember why she was here in the first place. She knew she wouldn't always get it right. She knew there would be more moments where she would falter, where she would be impatient or frustrated, or where she might make a mistake. But today, in this moment, she had made a choice. She had chosen to face her mistake, to apologize, and to learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but the weight of the conversation with the elderly woman stayed with Laura. As she clocked out at the end of the day, she felt different, not lighter exactly, but more grounded, more aware of the people around her. She knew that every interaction, every moment, was an opportunity to do better, to show kindness, and to make sure that the people she interacted with felt seen, heard, and respected. And as she walked out of the store, the cool evening air brushing against her face, Laura couldn't help but think that this feeling, this understanding was the kind of change that would stick with her. Not just for a day or a week, but for the rest of her life. And that, in itself, was a kind of redemption.